Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and for the last few months we have been going through a series of Bible decodes of various kinds. We've been fixated for a little while on the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, that the New Testament was not written by Jews in Palestine, but by the Roman Caesars at Caesar's palace in Rome, and that they did this because it was a psychological operation, a psyop, to fool the Jews into now worshiping a Jewish Messiah called Jesus. And the reason why they wanted to do that is because they were sick of dealing with the militarism of the Jews. Ever since the Romans took over in Judea in about 63 BC, there was an almost endless cavalcade of wars and uprisings, insurrections, revolutions by the Jews. And this is something that the Romans couldn't really deal with because they had so many other nations under their umbrella that they didn't really want to give any of these other nations any ideas, because they recognized that if there were these kind of uprisings all over the place, they wouldn't be able to handle it. Generally, the Romans tried to absorb nations into their empire, and they used an attempt to really absorb the religions of these people into their empire by honoring them. And so the Roman structure was really that there were, they celebrated literally hundreds of different religions on a yearly basis. You know, every day it seemed was a different, a different group of people who was, whose God was being honored on that day. And in return, you pretty much had to put the statue of Caesar in your temple. So that was kind of what they wanted. And the Jews were not obliging. First of all, the Jews had a stricture against graven images. So putting the statue of Caesar in their temple would have certainly been enough for them to fight to the death. And in general, the Jews had a very zealous and jealous monotheistic God that called his people the chosen ones. So they were already, separatist and xenophobic. They didn't really trust anybody else. And not like they should have trusted the Romans of all people, but and they had a lot of relatively strange rituals and beliefs that they kept up as part of their faith. The circumcision and the kosher food laws, the animal sacrifice laws. Many of them were certainly the mark of an obsessive compulsive God, a control freak God. And the Romans were trying to, as they say, they called it pruning or domesticating the Jewish God, because that was how they were planning on fitting God into their, fitting the Jews into their empire. And so this culminated in the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 A.D. This started under the rule of Emperor Nero, and when another thing about the Jews is that they were expecting a Messiah. The whole environment of the first century was one of expectation of a Messiah coming due to prophecies that were in the Old Testament and or in the Jewish scriptures, because there was no Old Testament really at that point. But they were waiting for a military leader, a military Messiah who was going to help them throw out the colonial power and regain sovereignty in Judea. And there were several candidates for that messiahship that arose during the first century. The Dead Sea Scrolls talks about one they called the Teacher of Righteousness, even though that may have been a little bit earlier. Hard to say whether the Dead Sea Scrolls are a first century AD or BC kind of thing. I think AD, but there was also Judas the Galilean and Gamaliel, and the son of Gamaliel. I think his name was Judas, but it might have been Jesus. And then also Simon, John, and Eleazar, who were in charge of the Jewish zealot faction that actually kicked out the Herod puppet government in Jerusalem in 66 AD. And they the response from Emperor Nero was to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And it wasn't nearly as easy as the Romans were hoping it was going to be. And it turned into really a 7-year war, during which time Rome broke out into civil war. Emperor Nero was assassinated, and then a succession of 3 Roman emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, were all assassinated within a 12-month period. And so in 69 AD, General Vespasian was named the new emperor, and he went to Rome to be the new emperor. He appointed his son Titus to be the new military commander in Jerusalem or Judea. Eventually, Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, or Emperor Vespasian died then in 79 AD, and his son Titus became the new emperor. And then his younger brother Domitian became the new emperor when Titus died in 81 AD. So these 3 Roman rulers, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, are called the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Flavian means golden or blonde, and they are the primary culprits in really all of the, or most of the literature that's out there that forwards the Roman origins hypothesis. They mostly believe that it came from the Flavian dynasty of Caesars in the 70s AD. And what they did is that they wrote the story of the New Testament, in particular the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they backdated the story by 40 years. So they set the story in the 30s AD. And they wrote it really to be performed as a play in front of other people, which makes sense because most people didn't read. And it was written, however, in Greek, which I think lends a lot of support to the Roman origins hypothesis because Greek and Latin were the two primary languages in Rome, whereas Jesus and his followers most likely would have been speaking in Aramaic, and only a small fraction of the literate population in Judea would have been able to read Greek, much less write in Greek. And but that's one of many arguments for the Roman origins hypothesis. It also is absolutely right down the wheelhouse of the Romans' MO. They created a number of other religions here in the 1st century AD. Titus created two other ones, a cult for his father Vespasian and another cult for his sister Flavia Domitilla, who was known as one of the first Christians. That meaning they were the Christians who worshiped Titus, because what they did with the New Testament is that they wrote a story of Jesus, and the story that they wrote of Jesus was in parallel to the actual history of the War of the Jews. So they wrote this other story called War of the Jews, or Jewish War, under the pseudonym Josephus. And so this is supposed to be a history of this Jewish war. And it was met the approval of Titus. He sanctioned it or endorsed it. And Josephus was actually adopted as a member of the Roman royal family. He became known as Flavius Josephus. He lived in a townhouse at Caesar's palace for the last 25, 30 years of his life. And whoever he was, a lot of people think it was this guy Arius Piso who wrote under the name of Josephus, among other names. But the Romans were big on using pseudonyms and pen names and aliases and so on. But the story of Josephus, or the history of Josephus, talks about Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea, among other things. This is just one of many themes between these two documents that were clearly written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. So if we know that Josephus was living at Rome when he wrote War of the Jews, we have to suspect that he was also living at Rome when he wrote the New Testament, because the amount of parallels between the two are overwhelming. And that was the purpose of this author, Michael Menescot's, that we're going to be talking about. His book, Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, goes into finding the parallels between the book of Luke, the third gospel, and War of the Jews. He found over 250 parallels between the two. That's over 10 per chapter of Luke. But one of the main themes that's involved in this is that Titus's 3-year military campaign is mirrored by Jesus's 3-year ministry in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. In the same order. They go to a number of different locations in their respective 3-year residencies, and they go in the same order, and where they go, they encounter different adventures, so to speak, or different circumstances or events, and they are linked typologically. They're not the same events, but they are typologically similar. They have the same concept. There is a similar concept or several similar concepts running through each one of the stops that they make on their various campaigns. And again, the places are identical, and the times are offset by 40 years, often to the hour. But again, this is just one of many sets of parallels between the two books. And so what Menescot's did when he found the 250 parallels in the book of Luke, he graphed them out on a chart with the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every place he found a dot, he plotted a point. At the end of putting all 250 points down, he found that he had made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin. Latin, which is the language of the ancient Roman elite, the Caesars. And meaning that not only did the Romans write the book of Luke, but they literally signed their names to it. The letters are APTVS. Now, I think we know for sure that the TVS stands for Titus Vespasianus, and they literally used that same imprint on coins that they minted during their reign. So the TVS is a clear signature of Titus Vespasian. The AP, as I said, I think stands for Arius Piso, who was kind of like the shadow emperor under Titus and Vespasian. Now, Menescot goes through all 250 of these parallels in exhaustive detail, and that's kind of what we've been doing going through these. Now, right now, we're kind of in the midst of one, so if you want to get the flavor of the first part of it, you probably want to tune into the second half of yesterday's episode. But we'll, if you might be able to pick it up here as we move here, right off the bat. Again, we see John or Jonathan, John the Baptist, who is being compared with Jonathan, the Jewish zealot, one of the candidates for a Messiah that the Jews are trying to domesticate or prune. So, again, what they did is they were worried about the militancy of the Jews. And so they took the leaders of them and they pruned them or domesticated them or neutralized them or neutered them. And they did that by proposing a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and turning the other cheek on oppression and walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack and believing that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel and, said, Father, forgive the Romans for they know not what they do. But at the same time, condemning the Jews outside the temple by overthrowing the tables of the Jewish money changers, because the Jewish money changers were changing out Roman coins with graven images on them for Jewish coins so that they could be brought into the temple for offerings, and disrupting the commerce of the Jews who were selling pigeons and doves and so on for animal sacrifice rituals in the temple. So again, Jesus is a very odd Jew who is completely pro-Roman, never doing anything against the Romans throughout the entire Gospels, and condemning the Jews left and right. So he is exactly the kind of Messiah that the Romans would have made up. Now, you also have to remember that the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, on distribution. they were the only people that could have done this. They were the only people that had a fleet of slaves whose job was all day to write copies, to make copies of the text. They had a monopoly on the postal system. Nothing is going to be distributed unless Caesar finds it to be okay. And indeed, the only documents that really of history that exist from the first century are Josephus's War of the Jews and his later work, Antiquities of the Jews, and the New Testament. Now, you can add to that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the mid-20th century, and curiously, not really translated for the public for almost 40 years, or even over 40 years. Okay, so again, we see John or Jonathan cast as the low one that tried to raise himself up, but gets brought down again by Jesus in Luke and by Priscus in the Jewish War. And again, this is described in connection with John's tomb, a metaphor for Hades or hell. Whilst the bringing down of the fig tree is a metaphor for the fall of Judaism, it's only with an awareness of the riddle in paragraph 616 that we can see that this is linking a Roman centurion whose name is First, or Priscus, to control over heaven and hell. This aligns with earlier work by Roman Piso suggesting that one of the many phrases historical writers used to refer to Arius Piso was primus, which also means first. Again, we see the link in Luke to someone who is mightier, comes behind. Behind, the word for behind in Greek is opiso, O-P-I-S-O, which also means the piso. So, who is mightier comes behind, opiso, who will gather wheat to the barn and chaff burnt with fire unquenchable. This is again saying that the piso is the arbiter of access to heaven and hell. Now, I think it's quite possible that Arius Piso wrote the maybe the Book of John or some other later the Book of Acts, maybe, although that seems to be written by the same person who wrote Luke, but and maybe the Book of Luke as well. But that Titus and Vespasian might have written Mark and Matthew, because you can kind of tell if you look at the thumbnail, you can see that the A and the P are not nearly as well defined as the T, the V, and the S. And so it's hypothesized that the A and the P were written in a later point. Now, but regardless, it's always saying that the Roman is the God. So many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled by Titus in War of the Jews, meaning that Titus is, according to Josephus's history, which scholars and Christians alike regard to be one of the great works of history ever, that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. The prophecies that Jesus makes are fulfilled by Titus, or at least many of them, more than a dozen of them. Finally, to complete this chapter, I plot the latest parallels below, with the latest ones I've described highlighted in green as usual. So he's just adding more dots to his ongoing chart. I pretty much just put the final chart on the thumbnail. The ones in black are, I believe that's where Jewish War is parodying the book of Luke, And the ones in blue are where Jewish war is being parodied by the book of Luke. So it's a mutual parody. It's not like one is only parodying the other. It goes back and forth. They were written by the same time, at the same time by the same people. Okay, this brings us to the end of the parallels forming the T, V, and S. Since the parallels in the A and P are generally less interesting, the next few chapters will have more focus on why the pattern cannot be the result of coincidences, and on the meaning of the APTVS pattern, and on how Emperor Domitian appears to have meddled in the project after Titus's death. Now, it's been often reported that Domitian was rather jealous of his older brother Titus and tried to denigrate him after Titus's death. But he did deify him. So, you know, that's another thing that's important to notice, is that both Vespasian and Titus were among the 5 Roman emperors who were deified, along with Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and Claudius Caesar. So they literally, according to the law of the Romans, they literally were gods. But Domitian was actually damned. So they erased, after he died, they erased his memory. But I don't think that necessarily means that he was a bad guy, necessarily. Okay, and on how Emperor Domitian appears to have meddled in the project after Titus's death to ensure that he could be later revealed as the third aspect of God, which would be the Agios Pneuma, or AP, meaning Holy Spirit. So that's another alternative, conjecture about what the AP stands for. Again, it's not really that big of a deal what it stands for. The important thing to know is that they signed their name to the book of Luke. And that, the mere presence of Latin letters there goes way beyond the coincidental explanation, any type of explanation that this is a coincidence. But I think he's actually going to try to prove that here. So the next chapter, chapter 14, is called the right-hand edge of the A. So the downslope of the A here. Most of the parallels forming the A and P aren't very interesting. So, which is another reason to suspect it was written at a later period by maybe somebody else, or certainly by somebody in more of a hurry than the original TVS part of the graph. And that makes complete sense because War of the Jews is covering the period of 66 to 73 AD. But the first 2 books of the 7 volumes, really the first half of the paragraphs, are talking about a previous period, going all the way back to like 100 BC, and kind of laying out the background for the story. So they certainly could have been written later. Most of the parallels forming the A and P aren't very interesting, so I will only list the most interesting ones here and relegate the rest to the appendix. I will, however, detail those that form the right-hand edge of the A because I will use this particularly well-defined feature of the APTVS pattern to prove that the pattern is genuine and not a series of coincidences, and that my research cannot be a case of finding patterns in noise. So without further ado, now I would also say this finding patterns in noise, if a Christian, really a truther, comes, with that, oh, this is just a coincidence, this is finding patterns in noise, the chances of this being a coincidence are so much less than your average Q post or your you know, your 17, your group of 17s that you find in some kind of a picture or a scene, or, you know, this goes way beyond that, way beyond that. So if you're willing to accept those kind of patterns, then you really need to be able to accept these kind of patterns. So without further ado, I will resume by describing a group of parallels that forms that extraordinarily straight and thin diagonal line on the right-hand side of the A. As I do so, observe that we are working forwards through the story of Jewish war, yet commensurately working our way backwards through the story of Luke. You know, because moving forward on the War of the Jews, but moving backward in Luke. That's the right-hand side of the A. So he starts here with the parody of the story of Jesus in Jewish war. So he's quoting some of the early paragraphs here. Jewish War 86 and 87. That's book 1, chapter 13, paragraphs 2 and 3. Herod's men chased them to Jerusalem, but the people came and burnt those men. Jerusalem was full with the festival of Pentecost. Antigonus wanted Pacorus to be accepted as a reconciler or peacemaker. But Pacorus took Hyrcanus, who was one of the Maccabee leaders, who Jewish War elsewhere identifies as advisor to Cleopatra's lover. And then the next paragraph says, now at Galilee he gave them gifts. Antigonus devoted many women with them. They waited for Herod to be informed of their treachery, but they saw the guards not far away. Okay, I think I'm supposed to be matching these up with in Luke right now here. Okay, so this is Luke 23, 7, 17, 30, 32, and 36. Herod was at Jerusalem at the end of a festival, and one who was called Cleopas, not Cleopatra, but Cleopas, answered Jesus. They said, did not our heart burn with us? Jesus stood in the middle of them saying, peace be to you. And then moving to verse 55 and 56, the women who came with him from Galilee came and saw the grave, bringing spices.